When a video game is critically acclaimed and hugely successful, a franchise is pretty much assured. If the first installment is a mammoth hit, it's likely to lead to a gaggles of sequels, prequels, and spin-offs. However, a beloved title is also likely to spawn something else: copycats. After a platformer, sim, or beat-em-up becomes a trailblazing icon, it isn't long before a multitude of doppelgangers come out of the woodwork to ride its coattails. But you know what? A spiritual successor shouldn't be classified as unoriginal just because it draws inspiration from another source. In fact, some air quotes rip-offs actually managed to surpass their forerunner. And that's what we're here to talk about today. As I'm Jules, this is WhatCulture.com, and these are 10 video game spiritual successors that are better than official sequels. Number 10. Blazing Chrome, inspired by Contra. Even though Contra has had some pretty decent sequels over the last decade or so, none have come close to matching the classic series. In fact, Konami's bullet hell shooter has been surpassed by many spiritual successors, including Metal Slug and Vampire Survivors. Then there's Blazing Chrome. Joy Master's side-scrolling platformer is so masterful at emulating its inspiration that many players would genuinely believe that it's a forgotten run-and-gun from the SNES or Genesis era if they played it with zero context, and the trailer also perfectly nails the cheesy 90s vibe to a T. While blasting at this screen-filling bosses and listening to catchy chiptunes, it's easy to forget that this isn't an official Contra sequel. Although critics took umbrage with the brutal difficulty curve and outdated controls, these factors further highlight how well this kick-ass clone captured the spirit of Contra. Blazing Chrome couldn't have come out at a better time either, since it was released the same year as the abominable Contra Rogue Core. Every aspect of this twin-stick shooter screams bland, whether it's the graphics, the bosses, or the tedious mission structure. The recently released Contra Operation Gallagher was a huge improvement, but it still came up short when compared to this, Blazing Chrome. Number 9. Arx Fatalis, inspired by Underworld Ascendant. Blue Sky's Underworld series deserves far more credit than it ever received. Without this dungeon simulator, we may never have gotten Deus Ex or Bioshock, and it also laid the foundation for Blue Sky's later work, including System Shock and Command & Conquer. Gaming designer Rafael Colantonio was such a fan that he decided his company's first game would be a love letter to Underworld. In fact, Colantino strongly considered making Underworld 3 until he realized that he'd actually have more freedom if he developed a new property. Despite being a commercial failure, Arcane Studios' debut title was heavily praised, particularly for its sound design, compelling story, focus on atmosphere, intuitive spell system, and superb voice acting. Most importantly, Arx Fatalis nailed the nostalgia, making fans pine for an Underworld sequel even more. So when Other Side Entertainment announced another Underworld was in the works, well, it sounded like a dream come true. However, saying Underworld Descendant fell short of expectations, well, that doesn't do it justice. This broken sequel suffers from an unfair save system, atrocious enemy AI, and rampant bugs. Due to its unfinished state, some critics like Rock Paper Shotgun refused to review it. With a Metascore of 37%, it's no surprise that developers haven't made a single game since. Arx Fatalis was far from perfect, but it was leagues ahead of Underworld's official sequel. Number 8. Wargroove, which was inspired by Advance Wars. Even though Intelligent Systems' War franchise has been around since the 80s, 2001's Advance Wars helped the turn-based franchise find newfound popularity. The cartoony war game was astoundingly addictive, spawning a slew of direct follow-ups. Although Advance Wars has plenty of copycats, none followed the blueprint better than 2019's Wargroove. As enjoyable as Advance Wars is, it does take a while to get the hang of, which is why each installment starts with a pretty lengthy tutorial. However, Chucklefish's pixel art titles, controls, and mechanics are easy to pick up, allowing players to delve right into the gameplay. It also allows players to create their own maps and link missions together. While Wargroove was scratching that nostalgic itch, WayForward dropped a remake of the first two Advance Wars installments in 2023. Advance Wars 1 and 2 Reboot Camp was a wonderful blast from the past that was worth a revisit for hardcore fans, but despite the graphic overhaul, it was diminished somewhat by rather dated mechanics and unbalanced multiplayer and lack of matchmaking. Just to really put Advance Wars in its place, Wargroove 2 came out the same year, outshining the competition with ease. The sequel offered more content, better designed campaigns, and a greater variety in missions, and a new roguelike mode. So yeah, it kind of left the original in the dust, as sad as it is to say. Number 7. Diddy Kong Racing, which was inspired by Mario Kart 64. Mario Kart 64, the sequel to Super Mario Kart on the SNES, was a juggernaut upon its release, selling almost 10 million units, making it the second most successful N64 game ever. Almost a year later, Rare released Diddy Kong Racing, which also centered around drivers collecting power-ups to give them the edge whilst racing. Since the cutesy title resembled Mario Karts for kids, nobody expected it to actually outshine the Italian plumber. Against the odds, Diddy Kong Racing came out on top in nearly every department. Though Mario Kart 64 relied on 2D sprites for the races, Diddy's cast had fully rendered 3D sprites. The levels were more diverse, since the drivers could take to the sea and air. Collecting the same power-up repeatedly strengthened them, making every race rely more on strategy. Unlike Mario Kart, races in the back didn't receive better power-ups, and for this reason, Diddy offered a much bigger challenge. Although Mario Kart 64's multiplayer was incredible, its one player couldn't really hold a candle to Diddy. Rather than utilising a Grand Prix-styled campaign, Diddy's adventure mode takes place in a hub world, compelling players to seek out new races and key items. A certain amount of races had to be beaten to unlock harder ones, giving players a greater sense of accomplishment. On top of that, there was also rock-hard bosses, hidden characters, and secret artifacts that unlocked new challenges. Mario Kart may be one of Nintendo's biggest franchises nowadays, but there was a time when it was coming in a distant second, eating Diddy Kong Racing's dust. Number 6. Bug Fables, which went up against Paper Mario: The Origami King. After the release of the first two Paper Mario titles, the cutout role player looked like it had a bright future ahead of it, but every follow-up since has been disappointingly average at best. As such, fans were praying that Paper Mario: Origami King would turn things around. Unfortunately, the Nintendo Switch title's fighting mechanics were unnecessarily complex and long-winded, befuddling the majority of players. It was clear that the developers didn't have many fresh ideas, since the bosses consisted of a stapler, coloured pencils, a rubber band, and a hole punch. Just to rub salt in the wounds, Bug Fables: The Everlasting Sapling, which was released the year before, retooled Paper Mario's formula better than the Origami King did. The Moonsprout game's turn-based title had simple controls, an intuitive combat system, and straightforward mechanics, making it way more accessible. With its beautiful aesthetic, well-developed characters, and beefy campaign, there's more than enough here to keep players entertained for hours on end. If Origami King owners are still ticked off they didn't get the Paper Mario experience they hoped for, well, they really need to give Bug Fables a go. Number 5. Lost Odyssey, which was way better than Final Fantasy XIII. Although some Final Fantasy installments fared better than others, Square's long-running saga didn't have a single bad entry for many years. Sadly, that winning streak came to an abrupt end thanks to Final Fantasy XIII. Despite the magnificent graphics and innovative battle system, this dud was let down by its mind-numbing linearity. Rather than allowing heroes to explore to their heart's content, they had to follow a set path for the majority of the main campaign. Free roaming is such an integral aspect of the franchise that it's preposterous as to why the developers decided to give it up. This fall from grace was emphasized further, considering the underwhelming sequel was released 2 years after Lost Odyssey, which was written and composed by the original Final Fantasy creators. Rather than overloading itself with convoluted gimmicks, Lost Odyssey utilized old-school mechanics like random battles, timed button presses, and straightforward skill systems. Most importantly, the gameplay didn't involve walking through hallways for 10 bloody hours straight. The long loading screens and derivative story may have drawn some criticism, but there's no mistake that Lost Odyssey, if it was called a Final Fantasy game, would have been far better than Final Fantasy XIII. Number 4. Freedom Planet, which was better than Sonic the Bloody Hedgehog. Though Sonic the Hedgehog had great difficulty transitioning to 3D, there was no reason why the furry speedster couldn't continue as a 2D platformer. So when a direct continuation of the classic games was announced called Sonic the Hedgehog Episode 4, fans were overjoyed, especially since the project was being split into 3 parts. But due to the poor design, pretty rubbish puzzles, and generic boss battles, not even the nostalgia goggles could save this one. The same year that Episode 4 Part 2 was released, an indie developer called Galaxy Trail came out of nowhere with Freedom Planet, reminding everyone what an old-school side-scroller should actually feel like. Though the former Sonic fan game maintains the fast-paced action of its predecessor, the gameplay itself is more diverse, finding a balance between zippy platforming, innovative puzzle solving, and landscape-altering mechanics. And just to make this upset for Sonic even more humiliating, Galaxy Trail stole the Blue Hedgehog's thunder yet again, releasing the superior Freedom Planet 2 a year before the repetitive and rather lacking Sonic Superstars. With the up-and-coming development team trouncing Sonic not once but twice, it's obvious they have surpassed Sega's formerly unbeatable IP. Number 3, Stardew Valley, which was better than Story of Seasons. Long before Terraria, Littlewood, or Animal Crossing, the go-to farming sim was Story of Seasons, initially known as Harvest Moon. Boasting over 24 games, Yasuhiro Wada's IP didn't just popularize the genre, but monopolized it. Despite inspiring a heap of farming clones, none could knock Story of Seasons off its pedestal. Until, that is, Stardew Valley came along, which single-handedly rejuvenated interest in the genre in a way that no other game has before. Rather than focusing purely on farming, Stardew Valley allowed players to develop complex relationships with the NPCs, creating a richer and more personal gaming experience. Unlike Story of Seasons, gamers weren't compelled to keep playing just to check on their crops, but to also check on their friends and family. Thanks to the open-ended gameplay, fans could play for years on end without actually getting bored. Even though Story of Seasons has released multiple games since, they couldn't compete with Stardew Valley's presentation, addictiveness, or accessibility. Wada himself admitted during a GameSpot interview how Stardew Valley outclassed his creation since it just offered way more freedom than his franchise's later installments. Although Story of Seasons will always have a special place in many gamers' hearts, Stardew Valley was the uncontested king of farming sims. Number 2, Shovel Knight and how it dominated Mega Man 11. Now, 2014's Shovel Knight is much more than just a love letter to a bygone era. Yacht Club's magnum opus feels like a hybrid of every great platforming title merged into one, yet still feels unique and fresh. Though Shovel Knight shares DNA with DuckTales, Castlevania, and Super Mario Bros., it unmistakably draws most of its inspiration from Mega Man. Not only does it have a similar level structure, enemy patterns, and platforming pits to Capcom's robot-busting side-scroller, but some of the chiptune soundtracks were actually created by Mega Man composer Manami Matsume. Therefore, it seemed that Shovel Knight had actually taken control away from the Blue Bomber, but in 2018, Mega Man 11 was released, and fans, well, they were definitely anticipating a return to form. Sadly, the sequel only had one new mechanic to distinguish itself from its predecessor. Apart from that, it was more of the same. For this reason, Mega Man 11 came and went without really being noticed by anyone but the biggest Mega Man fans. Meanwhile, Shovel Knight was churning out content like crazy, including spin-offs and extra campaigns, which were later re-released as a compendium alongside the original game. During the 80s and 90s, Mega Man was a powerhouse in the 2D platforming circuit, but in the modern age, well, Shovel Knight is the only one that reigns supreme. And number 1, Bloodborne, which is controversially better than Dark Souls 3. Now, Dark Souls 3 surpassed all expectations despite having a lot to live up to. Not only was Hidetaka Miyazaki's hyped sequel a magnificent game in its own right, well, it served as a perfect ending to a towering trilogy, and yet it was still overshadowed by Bloodborne, which From Software released the previous year. Simply put, the Lovecraftian-inspired title has more to offer in terms of content, refined mechanics, and challenge. Although the main campaign is around the same length, Bloodborne has more replayability due to the randomly generated dungeons. The inventory also isn't a nightmare to manage this time around, and rather than relying on hacking and cheesing, combat requires a lot more strategy, timing, and raw skill. Honestly, the positives just go on and on. Bloodborne's weapons have greater versatility, the rock-hard bosses are more creatively designed, the health system is more balanced, and the DLC is borderline perfect. Also, it's deeply terrifying. Though Dark Souls 3 implemented elements from Bloodborne, including the faster-paced action and the charged attacks, the Gothic Souls-like still had the edge. Although none of this should take away from Dark Souls' legacy, its spiritual successor is superior in almost every way.